in 0 before the Common Era, a Jew who was living in North Africa or Babylonia after the destruction of the Second Temple, a Jew in Eastern Europe, but whether it was from Australia to North America, from South America to Europe, from Sydney, Australia to Toronto, from Long Beach, California, that's you, to Meknes in Morocco, from Odessa or Poltava in the Ukraine to Budapest to Portugal, for thousands of years, under all circumstances, there was one reality that was always there, in ghettos and in bunkers, in Stalinist Russia and in Nazi-occupied Poland. It was there, literally, in every single generation, among every single community. I want to tell you a story. The story takes us back to the 1950s, McGill University in Montreal. There was a debate between two people. One, Professor Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee was an English historian, wasn't very sympathetic to the Jewish people. Very, very well-known historian, Professor Toynbee. Debated the ambassador of Israel to Canada, Professor Jacob Herzog. Jacob Herzog was a brother of Chaim Herzog, who was later a president of Israel, children of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, second chief rabbi of Israel. He succeeded Rabbi Kook, the first chief rabbi. Jacob Herzog was a student of one of the great Lithuanian sages, Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer. And so, Herzog and Toynbee have a public debate at McGill University about Israel. Toynbee begins spewing his theory, namely, Jews are a religion, a culture, not a civilization or a nationality. Judaism is like Christianity or Islam. It's not connected to a particular land. Jews are not a nation. Jews are a culture. A Christian could be living in Australia, can be living in America. It's not connected to a particular land. Judaism doesn't have a land. It's an idea. It's a culture. And therefore Israel is not the Jewish land. Jewish people are part of all countries. They just have a culture, not a civilization. They're not a real nation. Judaism is an idea. This was Toynbee's argument. Professor Herzog responded to Professor Toynbee, and he says, I want to tell the following story, or give the following illustration. I'm going to elaborate, but the point was this. 3 Olympic planes land in an airport. The first Olympic plane lands in Athens, in Greece. Out comes a very old man. He has a long, impressive beard. You look at him and you can see, here's a man who's used his brain, philosophy. The attendant at the airport goes up to the plane and wants to help this old man come down. And as he comes down, the attendant turns to him and says, Sir, what's your name? He says, my name is Socrates. Socrates. Hi, Mr. Socrates. Have you ever been to Athens before? Socrates says, have I been to Athens before? Athens is my cradle. Tell me, how are the sages of Athens doing? How are the schools of Greek philosophy? How is the Acropolis? He says, the Acropolis, for $8.50, you can get a tour through its remnants. He says, but the Greek Empire doing? He says, what Greek Empire? Greece is barely surviving. Should I begin telling you about the crises of Greece? It's hard for us to keep our schools and gas stations open. He says, what about the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great? He says, my friend, there's no Greek Empire. We are a single country, and the last few years have been disastrous. We've tried to survive. So he said, so what's Greece? He says, Greece is a member of NATO. Socrates says, what's NATO? So he begins explaining to him what NATO is. He says, tell me, how is Greek philosophy doing? Is it studied in the whole world? Do people speak the language? He says there are some professors who study Greek philosophy, but it's not very popular today. He says, your language is not mine. What type of Greek are you talking? He says, I'm talking modern day Greek. He says, it's not the ancient Greek. What happened? He says, there's a few professors in Harvard who still speak that language. Most of us don't know that language. He says, can you take me to the temple of Zeus? He says, Zeus? Wake up and smell the coffee. There's no Zeus anymore. He says, so take me to Mount Olympus to worship the god of Mount Olympus. He says, what god of Mount Olympus? And he's a god. He says, so who do you worship today? He says, we have the Greek Orthodox Church. He says, what in the world is the Greek Orthodox Church? He says, you don't know what the church is. So I'll explain it to you. There was this Jewish guy who somehow became a god. The way it happened was this. Every Jewish boy is raised in a home with a Jewish mother. And every Jewish mother explains to their boy that not only is she God's gift to humanity, but he is actually God himself. So every Jewish boy grows up with the idea that he is God. However, most Jewish boys are lucky enough to marry a Jewish wife. And within a few weeks, she makes it very clear to him that he's not God, nor is he God's gift to humanity. He barely has a right to be a human. Unfortunately, Yoshka never got married. Yoshkala never got married. So he maintained the notion of his mother that he's God. And the world believed him. And the church was created. And now we have the Greek Orthodox Church. Socrates looks at him and says, this is not my Athens. I'm leaving. And he gets back on his Olympic plane and takes off. The second Olympic plane lands in Rome. Out comes a regal, noble-looking statesman. You can see the man has a lot of power, a lot of ambition, and a lot of cleverness. The flight attendant or the airport attendant approaches him, says, hello, what's your name? He says, my name is Julius Caesar. Caesar? Caesar salad? You made Caesar salad? Why, good God. Caesar! Is there no Caesar today in Rome? He says, what Caesar? What do you think you are, Caligula? Adrian? Vespasian? These guys are on Wikipedia. We have Caesar salad. He says, what do you mean? What's happening with my Roman Empire? Since that day of Et Brute, when I was cut down on the steps of the Senate, how is my empire doing? He says, I don't know how to tell this to you, but after Constantine, your empire really went down the drain. There is no Roman Empire. There hasn't been a Roman Empire for 1500 years. So what's Rome? Rome is a city. Weird. Country called Italy. What do you have exciting in Rome? Take me to the Colosseum. For $9.50. I'll show you its remnants. Take me to my gladiators. He says, for $10 my gymnasiums and circuses. He says, there's a few rocks left. So what do you have in Rome? We have the Vatican. What is the Vatican? Something called Catholicism. What's that? So he starts again. There was a Jew. His mother decided he was a god. He never got married. And now 2 billion people believe he's God. And they have this Vatican. They have a couple of dollars. They had one pope, they had another pope. Another pope decided to resign. Who knows why? Now they have a new pope. He says, take me to the god of Venus. He says, there's no god of Venus, I told you. There's Catholicism. He says, what language are you talking? Italian. What happened to Latin? He says, a few professors speak Latin. We don't speak Latin. So what do you pride yourself with? He says, we eat pasta and pizza. He says, do people still tremble when they hear the word Rome? He says, sir, they don't tremble. We're a city in Italy and we're a member of NATO. What's NATO? So he starts explaining him what NATO is. Caesar says, this is not my Rome. I'm out of here. Gets back on the airplane and takes off. A third Olympic airplane lands in the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv. One very old man walks down the steps of the airplane, and an airport attendant, thank you.
Amen.
An airport attendant comes to greet him. And the man working in the Ben Gurion airport turns to this older man and he says 2 words, Shalom Aleichem. And the man responds, Aleichem Shalom. And the airport attendant looks at him and says in Hebrew, Ma Shimcha, what is your name? And he says, my name is Moshe. My name is Moses. So the airport attendant gets excited. Hey, Gam Shemi Moshe. My name is Moshe. Shalom Aleichem Moshe. Ma Shlomcha, Ma Nishma. What's your opinion, women at the wall? Falafel, pizza, man. He turns to the old man. He says, Moshe, where are you from? He says, I'm from Mitzrayim. I'm from Egypt. And where are you from? I'm from Tbilisi in Georgia. I made Aliyah 9 months ago. Came here to Israel. I'm from Georgia, Tbilisi. Moshe from Tbilisi turns to Moshe from Egypt. And he says, Moshe from Egypt, what brings you to this place? My land. My homeland. Have you ever been here before? So what makes it your homeland? He says, I worked hard for this country. I traveled 40 years to get into this country. I dreamt a lot about this country. I led a nation to this country. I never made it. Here I am. Bruchim Abayim, welcome Moshe to this country, but I want to tell you it's a very complicated country. It's not easy to settle. But one thing, you can become a citizen right away. You're a Jew, you can become a citizen right away. And the Lafa, in the stand near Yerushalayim, is the best in the country. If you like food, you go there. Ask them for French fries and shawarma and extra hummus. A little salad is also good. I don't know what you have in Egypt, but over there, the best one. And it's cheap, it's 9 shekel. And if you need the money, you go to the Western Wall and you ask. And some American tourist will feel guilty. Moshe from Egypt looks at Moshe from Tbilisi and he says, I'm a little uncomfortable, but I have to ask you a favor. I was in a rush and I forgot to bring something. This is something I use. I don't know if you have it here, but maybe. I forgot to bring my talis and my tefillin. Do you know You're religious. You're ultra. Only you know. Yeah, man. You think I know nothing? And he pulls up. He says, look at this. And I just put on tefillin. Some Chabad guy made me crazy. They go make everybody crazy. Tefillin. I don't know. They're obsessed. Don't ask me if I know what tefillin is. Now you're an arrogant, religious, ultra-Orthodox Jew telling me if I know what. So I know exactly what you know. And my father was a very big rabbi in Tbilisi. And I don't know who your father was. Where were you raised? In which palace were you raised? We're not going to talk about who raised you. But my father was a big rabbi. And of course you can. Of course. And I have in my house, I'll give you my talis and tefillin. Moshe says, well, you have talis and tefillin. Of course. Well, what are you, insulting us? Of course we have talis and tefillin. And he comes down. And Moshe says, I have another issue. I'm very, very hungry. Very, very hungry. He says, I don't understand. There's 100 restaurants right here. Go eat. He says, I have a problem. I eat something, but I don't know if you're familiar with it. Something called kosher. The fish need fins and scales. The animals need split hooves and chewing their cuds. There's a bunch of laws. You think I could find that? He says, you know, you come here from Egypt and you start insulting us. Here there's 100 restaurants, every one is kosher, and everyone has a different kosher certification. This is Mahadrin, this is Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, this is Glad, this is semi-Glad, this is Glad, right-wing, left-wing, centrist, liberal, progressive, this is Badatz, Eidah Hared, this is B'nai Brak, Jerusalem, Meir Shearim, against women, pro-women, love women, hate everything else. Whatever you want, you eat, and then you vomit. Don't start asking us if this kosher. Wow, you have kosher. Wow. He says, tell me, you have a place to pray, something called a synagogue? He says, I don't understand you. You have 30 synagogues and they don't speak to each other. You have Svart and Ashkenaz, Yemen, Haredi, very Haredi, progressive, semi-progressive, Keser, Nakdishoch, Nekadesh, even have Chabad. Hasidic, Misnagdish, Yeshivish, Black Hat, Kippas Ruga, White Kippas Ruga, Red Kippas Ruga, Blue Talis, White Talis, whatever you want, you have. And as he looks into one of them, Moshe from Tbilisi turns to Moshe from Egypt and he says, it looks like you don't know much about life here. You see this thing on the door? You know what it is? Moshe from Egypt says, what is it? He says, I don't understand. An old man doesn't know his things. This is called a mezuzah. He says, what is that? He says, shame on you. Go back to yeshiva. I'm from Tbilisi, know more than you, because my father was a big rabbi. In this parchment, and in the parchment, there are a few portions that were written by a guy named Moses. 3,500 years ago. Every Jewish home has it on the door. We kiss it. And then he says, Moshe from Egypt, I'll show you something nice. Right here, there's a school with Jewish children. And he takes them into the room, and there's a teacher with 30 Jewish children. And Moshe from Egypt hears the teacher reading loud with the children. Vayedaber Adon Shem el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moses, saying, and 2 tears streamed down the face of the 2 Moshes. Professor Herzog turns to Professor Toynbee and says, Professor Toynbee, Socrates comes to Athens. Julius Caesar comes to Rome. 2 of the most influential people of the ancient world that shaped Western civilization. And when they meet today, the people of Greece or of Rome, they don't speak the same language. They don't share the same faith. They don't practice the same traditions. They have almost nothing in common. Not physically, not conceptually, and not spiritually. Yet, the Greeks and the Italians, you call a nation. Moses comes to Israel today. The same language, the same faith, the same traditions, the same mitzvot, the same Torah, the same rituals, the same practices. same mezuzah, the same tefillin, the same Torah. That's not a nation. What is a nation? And then it reminded me of the story they told that occurred in a bunker in the Warsaw Ghetto, 1943. You know that the uprising began Passover 43, April 1943, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in a little bunker, there was a father, a mother,